Wonderful. Well, thanks so much, Jessel, and thank you all so much for having us here today. We really appreciate and admire the work that SJN, Hearken, Trusting News, and then especially all of you guys are doing in newsrooms across the country to really help strengthen democracy, especially in the build-up to the upcoming midterms. So my colleague Mary Bennett and I could not be more excited to be here with you today to share some current findings regarding our political and civil climate, and to work together on strategies that can help mitigate fear and pessimism as we continue through this election season. So we have a bit of a better sense. I know a few folks have dropped their name and newsroom in the chat. If you haven't yet, we'd love to see who's on the call. So please drop your name and newsroom in the chat. And that also selfishly gives me a minute to figure out how to share my screen. Perfect. Well, thank you. So for those who don't know us or were unfamiliar with our work, More in Common is a nonpartisan research and audience-centric nonprofit that works to build societies and communities that are stronger, more united, and more resilient to the increasing threats of polarization and social division. So we approach our work through a social psychology lens, specializing in attitudinal and segmentation research, which strives to get a more complete picture of how different segments of the population see the world, connecting their views on pressing issues and susceptibility to things like disinformation and extremism to their core values, their identities, and their beliefs. And then informed by this research, we work with a range of diverse partners, from democracy building organizations to faith leaders to philanthropy and to news outlets like you all, to help test new interventions that could help build resiliency and to provide communications and messaging guidance and training to help disrupt some of the harmful and toxic polarizing narratives we're seeing as elevated today. So our goal today is to provide you all with a brief introduction to some key drivers of political violence that have manifested over the past year and will continue to grow in the build up to the midterms. And then most importantly, to discuss what journalists and media can do to help mitigate fear, challenge disinformation, and equip your audiences to engage in healthy democratic practices. So we'll be sharing an important qualification at the beginning. We're going to be sharing a lot of research from partner organizations as well as data from surveys that we have run, but just wanted to emphasize that we are not experts or an organization that's really specializing in preventing targeted violence or countering terrorism. We see ourselves really as a convener in this ecosystem. And so the statistics and the recommendations that we're sharing with you today have been compiled from the great work that a lot of our partners are doing on the ground. So if you have any specific questions related to the stats or trends, we're happy to answer them, but also even happier to help connect you to some of those primary source organizations, as I imagine they could be really valuable resources for you all as you are building out your stories in the next few months. So on the agenda, we're going to begin with a brief presentation on kind of a threat landscape analysis given by my colleague, Mary Bennett. Then we'll spend the second half of our time together completing a brief scenario planning exercise to help you all continue to think through strategies and best practices for covering the midterms. Then we're going to reconvene as a larger group to debrief what we discussed. We'll share some best practices, but also hope that you all will chime in with some best practices and then open it up to any questions before we pass it back to Hearken and the SJN team. So with that, I'm going to mute myself and pass it over to my colleague, Mary Bennett.
Thanks so much, Julia, and thank you everyone for having us today. My name is Mary Bennett. I focus on the democracy portfolio at More in Common, and I'm really excited to be here with you today. So to kick things off for this portion of the presentation, I wanted to start with some key trends that we're seeing ahead of November, thanks to our incredible research partners. These are top-line findings, but we're more than happy to send a more extensive fact sheet along following the presentation for anyone interested in a deeper dive into any of these bullets and their respective nuanced statistics. So, top line, trust is on a decline across the country related to the state of America and America's democratic institutions. Violence during election seasons have spiked in the wake of the Trump presidency. Militias that can be affiliated with extremist sentiments and motivations have increased their recruitment and presence at protests and gatherings, which have resulted in a spike in armed protests and violence breaking out at public gatherings and protests. There's a critical shortage of poll workers across the nation, likely due to intimidation and threats of violence directed at election personnel that have resulted in a mass resignation of experienced workers and an influx of big lie supporters taking their places. Lastly, a number of controversially restrictive laws have passed or have been considered across the nation that risk limiting access to voting for historically marginalized populations. So now that I've started us on a really high note, let's dive into the definitions behind a few key terms we will be discussing today. So when we talk about political violence and violence related to the midterms, it's really important to get everyone on the same page with what we mean with each key term. OverZero, an incredible research partner of ours, has come up with a great definition for political violence, stating that it is violence aimed at political ends and relates to the controlling or changing of the benefactors of and participators in U.S. political, economic, and socio-cultural life. Electoral violence, a form of political violence, is any harm or threat of harm to any person or property involved in the election process or the election process itself during the election period, according to the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. Manifestations of these forms of violence have presented themselves in the forms of militia activity and credible threats towards political officials, election administrators, journalists, and academics, as I'm sure you're very well aware, and are being incited by new restrictive voting laws in certain states. As journalists, you will all know the benefits and limitations of public polls and the importance of digging into the stats. It's important to question how survey questions are worded, when polls are fielded, and how results are aggregated. But I wanted to provide a few top-line statistics to support the key trends mentioned a few slides ago. Beginning with citizens' loss of trust in America and America's democratic institutions, over the past year, a series of public polls have illuminated concerns about the state of democracy in the U.S. This summer, UC Davis Violence Prevention Research Program and California Firearm Violence Research Center found that 67.2% of Americans believe that there is a serious threat to our democracy. We're also seeing a greater acceptance of political violence across the political spectrum, with an August report from The Economist and YouGov citing concerns related to a possible second civil war in the next decade. Additionally, violence that has been justified or accepted these days is being seen across the aisle, according to a report from researchers Liliana Mason and Nathan Calmo as of last summer. In addition to a newfound acceptance of violence across the country, there has also been an increase in the presence of firearms at public demonstrations, thus resulting in increased potential of outbreaks of violence. And our partners have tracked a great majority of the responsibility of this increase in public firearms to militias such as the Proud Boys. According to a May 2022 report by ACLED and Everytown for Gun Safety, Proud Boys activity rose by 15% overall last year and increased engagement in violence by over 50%. Additionally, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace found that militias have been adopting new recruitment and mobilization tactics in the wake of January 6, such as encouraging members to use mainstream conservative causes and local rallies to increase recruitment while flying under the radar of national news. This has resulted in groups like the Proud Boys attending anti-critical race theory protests and other mainstream social events like pro-life and anti-vaccination rallies at a catastrophic rate compared to 2020. In the shadows, militia membership is also rampant. According to the ADL's Center on Extremism, a leaked Oath Keepers membership roll included the names of over 370 U.S. law enforcement officers, 100 military members, and over 80 politicians who were running for or served in public office as of early last month. On the receiving end of the violence are the election administrators, among others such as journalists. The Brennan Center for Justice noted that 1 in 3 poll workers said they felt unsafe and almost 80% wanted government-provided security as of last summer. Our wonderful partners at Bet the Vote found that an alarming stat, 130,000 poll workers have ceased serving over the past 2 midterm elections. And the Brennan Center for Justice also captured that 1 in 5 local election officials were unlikely to continue serving through the 2024 election. So this leads us into a critical shortage in election administrators and poll workers, and the question must be asked, who will take their place? According to a Republican National Committee staffer in Michigan, a strategy is in place to install party-trained volunteers that are prepared to challenge voters at Democratic majority polling places, to develop a website to connect those workers to local lawyers, and to establish a network of party-friendly district attorneys who could intervene to block vote counts at certain precincts, according to a Politico report from June this year. Lawmakers are also working to change the landscape of state-specific voting rights. According to a Brennan Center for Justice report from January of this year, 19 states have passed 34 laws restricting access to voting, which make it more difficult for voters to cast mail ballots that count. These laws also make in-person voting more difficult by reducing polling place hours and locations. They increase voter purges or the risk of faulty voter purges, and criminalize the ordinary lawful behavior of election officials and other individuals involved in elections. These new laws have mobilized voting rights groups, which could lead to more potential for political violence through militia mobilizations and other forms of counter-protest. On the converse, this same report noted that at least 25 states enacted 62 laws with provisions that expand voting access, which ease processes for requesting and casting a mail ballot and having that ballot counted. These new laws expand early voting time periods, improve access for disabled voters, strengthen language access provisions, expand or implement automatic voter registration, and restore voting rights to formerly incarcerated people, among other measures. It's important to be aware of the bad news and the threats, but it's also important to recognize hopeful improvements to our democracy when they exist. As we approach the 1-month marker ahead of this year's election, it's important to be fully aware of the threats to democracy. We've outlined a few forces at play, but these are just a few of the many dynamics that have the potential to spark political violence. It's also important and exciting to acknowledge the role and opportunity that the media play in this season. I'm now going to pass it back over to Julia, who's going to provide an overview of our upcoming activity, focused on navigating through the remainder of this year as a member of one of the most critical pieces of our democratic infrastructure. Thank you. Julia.
Great. Thank you so much, Mary Bennett. Really appreciate your presentation and you outlining some of those driving forces. So we're going to spend the next 20 or so minutes doing a scenario planning exercise in small groups. So I'm going to ask you all to imagine, unless one of you does in fact work for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, that you are a journalist with the Atlantic Journal-Constitution, which is the only major daily newspaper in the metropolitan area of Atlanta, Georgia, and has an average daily readership of 175,000. You've been asked to report on the upcoming midterm elections. So I'm going to start by reading you all a hypothetical scenario that outlines the potential evolution of events during the midterm election in Georgia, touching on many of the forces and tension points Mary Bennett just outlined. Then we're going to divide into 2 breakout rooms where you'll walk through a series of questions intended to spark reflection and conversation on what work you all can be doing now to feel prepared to accurately and holistically report on the results. We'll then return to the larger group at 3:40 and spend the final few minutes reviewing some best practices. So I'm going to start off by posting the scenario in the chat so that you all have a link to where it's to the Google document, but I'll also read it out loud. I would encourage you to open it up and follow along, as it'll be a valuable resource once you're in your small groups. So just as a reminder, the scenario takes place midterm elections in Georgia. So all eyes are on Georgia, a pivotal swing state with competitive U.S. Senate, gubernatorial, and Secretary of State races. Tensions were high and the lines were long at polling stations throughout the state. Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger ordered state patrol to guard the polls, citing safety concerns given the rise in threats directed at election officials. Hispanic American voters at one Atlanta polling site reported being asked if they were U.S. citizens by one on-duty officer. One observer on social media noted that the officer in question has alleged ties to a far-right militia group. Groups on both sides of the aisle, including some far-right groups who endorse the Big Lie, a conspiracy theory that alleges the 2020 presidential election was stolen from former President Trump, trained and deployed thousands of poll watchers throughout the state, including local and out-of-state volunteers. Poll watchers at several locations were removed after taking photographs of voters whom they claimed were using expired or fake IDs. A poll watcher streamed election officials unloading boxes at one polling site in Atlanta, alleging voter fraud and calling on voters to help shut down the site. Within 45 minutes, 10 volunteers arrived, including 2 members of local militia groups, and attempted to barricade the doors. A fistfight erupted, and the polling place was shut down for 2 hours as police arrested militia members and some bystanders. Videos from this incident were picked up by the right-wing media outlet Newsmax and shared widely on social media. As the polls closed, news outlets reported that Georgian voters turned out in record numbers, with over 4.3 million ballots cast. Later that evening, Republican Governor Brian Kemp claimed victory against Stacey Abrams after initial vote totals showed Kemp with a 3-point lead. Senator Abrams refused to concede, arguing Georgia's new restrictive voting laws had cost her the election and noting mail-in ballots had yet to be counted. The U.S. Senate and Secretary of State elections were too close to call, and the state is likely headed to a recount. Mail-in votes won't be tallied for a few days given staffing shortages. Throughout the evening, some local and national conservative politicians circulated false claims that mail-in voting is susceptible to fraud. Early the next morning, a coalition of voting rights groups issued a joint press release calling on activists to join them in front of the Georgia Capitol building to challenge Georgia's oppressive new voting laws. Thousands gathered on the Capitol steps by 5:00 p.m. Voters from communities in and around Atlanta spoke about waiting in line for hours and being turned away if they had an expired ID. Others said they were denied the ability to vote after being told they were no longer on their voting rolls. By 6:00, members of local militia groups, including Proud Boys and Oath Keepers, organized a counter-protest. As tensions rose, scuffles broke out in the crowd. One man who claims he was assaulted drew a weapon and opened fire on the crowd. So I'm going to pause there. I know that's a heavy note to end on, but we'll now go into breakout groups. So appreciate SJN facilitating that process, where your facilitator will walk you through a series of questions to help you think how you could best prepare to thoroughly and accurately and comprehensively report on that scenario. Great, thank you all. I think that's most folks. Give me a moment while I share my screen again. All right, hopefully you all can see that. So really appreciate you participating in the small group discussions. Hope that your conversation was fruitful and started to spark some ideas or connections to others in the field. I know that capacity, particularly for journalists, is always challenging, but just wanted to note that scenario planning can be a really valuable tool for newsrooms if it's not something you're actively doing already, to help you kind of anticipate and prepare for what's to come in, and can also help you think about what stories you should be writing now, so that you are kind of priming your audience and pre-bunking some myths that might be coming down the pipeline. I know as journalists, you're all tasked with telling the story of our democracy at this moment in time. And so that involves balancing narratives that underscore the magnitude of this crisis and the very real threats and implications of political violence, with stories that also highlight solutions, a nuanced analysis, and offer a more hopeful path forward. So that's certainly no easy task. I'm going to spend the last couple minutes reviewing some best practices that we've compiled, but would encourage you all to unmute yourself or drop other ideas in the chat, as you all are the experts. So please feel free to chime in with other thoughts, either from your discussion or your work more generally. So first best practice or recommendation we have is that I shared this with my small group. It's really crucial that you all become experts on how elections are administered by your state and local government. Would encourage you, if you haven't already, to really learn the nitty-gritty details. So who certifies the results and when? What triggers a recount? When and how are mail-in ballots counted? What are the legal parameters for poll watchers? What's considered voter harassment? On election night, election administrators are going to be swamped, so won't necessarily have time to field your calls or offer election administration 101 orientations. So the more that you can put your investigative research skills to the test in advance, the more prepared you'll be to tell a more complete and holistic story. Second recommendation we want to flag is just the importance of building relationships with diverse experts early. Many of you probably already have these relationships, or would encourage you to start to develop them over the next few months. So reach out to local election administrators. I really valued someone in our group flagged that folks usually trust people in their local election administrators versus at the state level. So that's an important consideration. Think about what voting rights groups exist in your community, who are the violence prevention experts, who are the legal experts, what organizations are training poll watchers. And those are all really great sources of information, both to help spark story ideas and also to help you develop more robust reporting. Third, wanted to flag the importance of building relationships with communities who are directly impacted. So whether that's a marginalized community that's impacted by the new voting laws, or maybe a Republican voter who's frustrated with the rise of election deniers on the ballot. Learn what election-related stories are important to folks on the ground, and then work to capture their voice and experience throughout the election season. Somebody flagged this in our group. Fourth recommendation we have is pre-bunk. So anticipate what myths or conspiracy theories might be circulating in your community. And over the next few months, write stories to help educate voters. So if your community historically has really high levels of absentee voters, write articles that talk about the security measures in place for absentee voters to help mitigate any potential myths about election or voter fraud. Also wanted to flag the importance of setting expectations early and often. My group also talked about this. You want to regularly remind your audience that an election night isn't necessarily results night. So if we don't have the results on that night, people aren't questioning why, or similarly questioning if there was fraud involved. They've already kind of been primed to have that expectation that it might take a few days. 6, wanted to flag, as Mary Bennett mentioned earlier, the importance of investigating statistics. So we opened the presentation with a series of public polls. Polling provides really critical insight into where your audience is at. However, it's also important for you all to do your due diligence, investigate how the questions were worded. For example, are they asking a leading question? Unpack how the results are synthesized. So for example, if you take the question, looking ahead to the next 10 years, how likely do you think it is that there will be a civil war in this country? And if the options are very likely, somewhat likely, not sure, not very likely, or very unlikely, the option somewhat unlikely is not really well defined. So participants could select that even if the odds in their mind are relatively low. So if the results are aggregated to include everybody who selected very likely or somewhat likely, it might overinflate folks' actual perceptions of the likelihood of a civil war happening and make it feel a bit more exaggerated in a way that's not always helpful for the national conversation. 7th, just wanted to emphasize the importance of prioritizing coverage that's proportionate to the threat and offers a path forward. As we established, the threats are real, so it's important to educate people, but to do so responsibly. You don't want to instill fear so that people don't turn out on election day or feel hopeless about the state of democracy. You're all really well oriented to the benefit of solutions-oriented stories. So I think this is a really exciting and pivotal moment to spotlight moments of success that are happening throughout the country. And then lastly, this is something that we've heard repeatedly in conversations with political violence experts. They're calling for a need for more open lines of communication between media outlets and the establishment of a coalition of journalists and editors and publishers who are working together across media, dedicated to the establishment of trust in elections and mitigating political violence. So that might be something you're all doing, but we're hearing from experts in the field that there's a need for that kind of collaboration and knowledge sharing to be amplified even more. So I'm going to pause there and stop my screen share, but just wanted to take these last 3 or 4 minutes to open it up to any other recommendations folks have on best practices they use in their reporting, or any questions you have of myself, Mary Bennett, or Solutions Journalism and Hearken more generally.
Yeah, I'm kind of wondering about something that some of my colleagues have experienced during past elections coverage, which is that people on a certain side of the aisle are very sort of open and welcoming and willing to talk to reporters, whereas people on the other side of that aisle are very antagonistic and unwilling to talk to reporters. And that sort of ends up where we have articles where you have a couple quotes from one party and no quotes from the other party because they wouldn't talk to you, and then you get accused of bias and of centering certain voices. because there's sort of like a concerted effort to not give the media information. Do you have any suggestions for how to deal with that?
That's a great question. I don't mean to deflect, but I feel like we are in the company of lots of experts who are probably navigating similar challenges. Does anybody want to jump in with an example of a time where they've navigated that successfully?
We've had politicians or candidates who would stonewall us because they didn't want to talk. And so we had to make it clear in our coverage that we tried calling them and writing to them. But as of this writing, they hadn't responded. I mean, that was kind of the best that we could do.
Did that work though?
Did that work for... It kind of helped, you know, with criticism. At least we did try. I mean, they'd have to say we didn't, and, you know, that would get into a different kind of realm.
Yeah, one thing we've spoken with some newsrooms about is actually putting a tracker up on some level to say how many times you've reached out to politicians, how long you've given them to respond, because, you know, there's a difference between we reached out and they were not available for comment and you gave them an hour versus you've done it 10 times and you've given them days and they've never responded. Tim, have you guys tried something like that?
Sort of. We have done that in one case with Congressman Scott Perry, who just hasn't talked to us probably since 2020. And the other thing we're doing with our gubernatorial candidate on the Republican side, Doug Mastriana, who many of you may have heard of, he just refuses to speak with anybody with, you know, the media. He goes to his you know, right-wing blogs and live streams and social media videos. So we have a line that just basically says he generally doesn't speak with you know, reporters from media organizations except far right groups, and he bars reporters from his events. I mean, it's a simple line, but you know, it's one we've had to use pretty much over and over, unfortunately.
Hey, Tim, what about his profit?
Oh, I just saw that NBC unearthed a 2019 interview we did with him where he basically said he would jail women who get abortions. So that's now, I guess, big news to everybody. So insanity.
One other thing too, if anyone's practicing like the citizens agenda approach, where you're really trying to get information from the electorate as to what they want politicians to be talking about, is to say the politicians are not responding to, you know, your calls for them to talk about this, but here's what we found that they've said in the past on the record about these topics, or here's just more information about these topics overall and how they work. So that you can at least inform voters about the issues that they care about, even if the politicians aren't forthright with what their stances are.
Something else I would just kind of build on that Jen said, that whole language about, like, I think sometimes we as journalists talk about how they're not getting back to us. But at the end of the day, if our mission is we are trying to talk to them because of the public, we should say, you know, they didn't get back to us. That prevents us from getting answers for you. This is something, you know, we are concerned about that we are trying to do for you. So it's just that language of, it's not about them getting back to us. It's about what that prevents. And I mean, I haven't seen a newsroom do this, but I'd be curious, like, if you then kind of give power to people to say, if you want them to talk to us, if you want to hear these answers, tell them, see if they will talk to us so we can get these answers for you. Again, I haven't necessarily seen a newsroom go that far. And if anyone has, I'd love to hear about it, but I'd be curious if you do that and put the power to the people, which at the end of the day, that's who we're trying to serve and get this information for.
If I could just drop in some insights from More in Common really, really quickly. I led a focus group last week with conservative shifters who I asked them about, you know, where do you receive the majority of your information? What sources are you going to for election information? And they all actually, they did not say like leftist media or any language like that. Instead, they all said that they're now going, you know, out on their own to Google and their various, you know, individual sources to try to find just facts, because they see the media as a no partisan lens this is a group of conservative shifters that said the media as just an overarching institution is, trying to convince you how to feel about particular facts and statements. So fear-mongering institution was the phrase that was used, but I kind of see that as a great opportunity that we're seeing less rhetoric, partisan rhetoric with the media at this point automatically being synonymous to progressives, liberals, and instead, maybe just having less ethos in the questions and providing them some space. If that is really, representative of more conservatives at this time. One of the conservative shifters even had an email listserv with CNN headlines for the week because they couldn't find another source to just give them headlines of information going on in the world for the week. So just thought those are some fun insights for you guys.
Great, thank you. Really appreciate everybody kind of chiming in into your expertise. Jessel, Jen, I'm not sure where we're at in time. I'm happy to pause, happy to take another question. We'll defer to your expertise.
Yeah, well, we're having a really great discussion, and I wanted to make sure Jen had a few minutes to share some resources. But if folks want to stay on and keep the conversation going, I think I'm happy to stay and help facilitate a conversation. And then if folks have to go, that's totally understandable as well. But I'm going to hand it over to Jen Hearken, Jen from Hearken.
Right on. Hi again, everyone. I just wanted to share a few different resources that you might not be aware of that we have on Election SOS that relates to this topic. So just so you know, our Election SOS collaborators from 2020 on have included these folks and more. So there is a lot of great information from organizations that work in these different spaces and not just news. So I wanted to share, we have this Trusted Elections Expert Network, which has almost 300 experts on it that have been vetted, folks who are nonpartisan, credentialed, et cetera. And if you type in extremism into the little search bar, you can find folks who cover extremism. You can also look at civil unrest, which is a category, and find a ton of different folks. And when you click into their bio, you'll be able to see a lot more about them and how to get in touch with them. So I'd also suggest folks to reach out to are people who might, on a national level, know how some of this stuff works. If these scenarios come to pass, or even have local expertise, there is state expertise is there as a filter as well. We also have a ton of webinars, checklists, fact sheets. I threw a few recommended resources in here that we'll share back out with everyone who's RSVP'd. So you can go through some of the additional support that's here. There's an amazing media playbook about how to cover electoral conflict that was made by Amanda Ripley, who taught us about good conflict / high conflict, as well as Rachel Kleinfeld, who is brilliant and does tons of work on this sort of thing as well. So, and it's in Spanish too. So if you want to share it with any of your colleagues, that's great. I have a link in there. We also have a really great video series for journalists who are covering extremism and who want to know more about the folks who are behind some of this violence and political violence. I just did a screenshot here of all the different videos. This is something you need to fill out a form to get, because we are careful and not wanting to point all of these resources out to people who are bad actors. So just please put your newsroom in there if you would like these resources. There's also tips for editors, tips for broadcast. If you have an extremism beat, digital safety and hygiene, there's so much good information here. Please just fill out that form and we can send it along to you. Then we also have a newsletter in which we will share some other things as they're coming about. We'll probably do 2 or 3 more newsletters between now and the midterms. If we can be helpful in any other ways, please let us know. I also, just in the 2 minutes we have remaining, want to throw it. I was very excited. I saw someone from the Center for Tech and Civic Life here, which does incredible work educating election officials and helping them really get up to speed on the threats and technology that they need to do their jobs these days. Kurt Sampsel is here. So I wanted to throw it to Kurt for any other resources he would like to point our way as well.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jen. I work with CTCL. We're a national nonprofit that supports the election administration field. And 2 resources that I just wanted to lift up, if you're not familiar with them, are Election Line and VoteBeat. Election Line does these daily digests of election news in different states. So it's a great way to really quickly get a look at the conversations that are happening regarding voting in other states, and kind of nationally gives you a good insight into the landscape. And VoteBeat is really good at kind of offering meta commentary about journalism happening regarding elections. So I really recommend checking that out as well. Thanks again.
Thank you so much, Kurt, for sharing that, and for Jenn and Mary Bennett and Julia Coffin from More in Common. Jenn shared contact information. Julia put in her email to get in touch with her. If you have more questions for More in Common, I know a lot of you have to go, and you know, I'm happy to stay on for a few minutes. If you guys have more questions, keep the conversation going. And we're also going to send out an email with all of these resources, and I believe we'll be sharing the recording as well if you want to share it with your colleagues that weren't able to attend, or just go back through and you know, get some more nuggets out from what we discussed. But yeah, I just wanted to say thank you all for participating. I think this was a really great conversation, and certainly a timely one, just 6 weeks ahead of the midterms. So thank you everyone. And there was just us.
Yeah. I think this Robert was using 2 devices.
Oh, okay.
So
Cool.
I think we're good to go.
Cool.
Great job.
That was great. Thanks, Nani.
Bye.
Bye-bye.